Continued on Thursday as government forces launched an assault on rebel-held positions in Tikrit, a city that fell to ISIL 2 weeks ago. Arriving by helicopter, Iraqi special forces reportedly engaged militants in fierce clashes in and around the city's university. Meanwhile, Iraq's parliament announced it would meet to elect a new government next Tuesday. This comes as some members of Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's own party suggested he may not be a viable candidate. And just a day after Syria launched airstrikes targeting ISIL, Maliki said there had been no coordination between the two countries, but that he welcomed the support.
We welcome this action. We actually welcome any Syrian strike against ISIS, because this group targets both Iraq and Syria.
Joining us now from Boston is Colonel Andrew Basovich, a veteran of 23 years in the U.S. Army, including service in Vietnam. He is currently professor of history and international relations at Boston University, and he's the author of several books. His most recent is Breach of Trust: How Americans Failed Their Soldiers and Their Country. Great to have you with us, Colonel. Good to see you again. ISIL continues to move through Iraq seemingly with impunity. Nouri al-Maliki, the prime minister, just yesterday rejected calls for a unity government despite pressure from the U.S. and others. Many are calling this a civil war that will lead to a split of Iraq into three countries, Sunni, Kurd, and Shia. The U.S. has committed a small group of some 300 military advisors and is trying to replace Maliki. You think both of those attempts at solving this problem will not work?
Well, I think we've got pretty limited leverage in this situation. Let me focus first on the military question. And I think there specifically the issue is whether or not the problems of the Iraqi army reflect a lack of skill or a lack of will. 300 advisors can, to some degree, make up a deficit of skill. I don't believe any number of Americans can make up for a deficit in will. At the end of the day, either Iraqi soldiers are willing to fight and die for their country or they're not, based on their performance against the ISIL forces over the past couple of weeks. Many of them seem not to be willing to fight and die for their country, and I think that's a huge problem. With regard to the politics, we just have very limited leverage, and we shouldn't deceive ourselves. And a further point there, if the United States were able to arrange for Maliki's departure from the scene, the big question then becomes who replaces him, and I'm not sure that we have the wisdom and the wit to choose a leader for Iraq who would actually be any more effective.
And I know you've written that you don't think the U.S. should be drawn back into Iraq, but what happens then if we don't get involved? We could see a failed state, we could see ungoverned territory. Aren't you concerned that it would become a haven for terrorists?
You bet. I mean, there are multiple outcomes, possible outcomes here. Very few of them are desirable. But when you're confronted with a problem, one of the first questions you have to ask yourself, is this a problem that we can solve? And despite all the chest thumping about America being a great superpower, there are quite a few number of problems in the world that we cannot solve. My judgment would be this is one of them, and therefore to attempt to do now what we couldn't do over 8.5 years after 2003 would arguably be just a waste of resources.
And you're also concerned that not only will sending military advisors in not solve the problem, that we could be seeing mission creep, that we might go down a slippery slope that would require us to be drawn back in?
Well, I think that's yes, that is a concern. I mean, the President and Secretary Kerry have said, boy, this is a big problem. These are important stakes. So the President is laying down a modest military marker, the advisors, and the apparent threat to use some airstrikes to try to turn things around on the battlefield. If this limited effort doesn't succeed, then the President is faced with the problem of either acknowledging failure, for which he will be held politically accountable, or of upping the ante. And that's that slippery slope to ever greater escalation. So he's put himself in a bit of a fix if the advisors don't turn the tables and if the ISIL forces continue to do well in the battlefield.
Now, you've compared what's going on in Iraq to Vietnam, and you talk about how President Nixon got out of Vietnam relatively quickly after President Johnson had gone all in. And then, of course, we saw Vietnam fall apart and become a full communist state. But you say that Nixon at least used the Vietnam exit to open relations with China, and that you don't see that happening here, that we won't get any kind of strategic advantage out of what's happening in Iraq unless President Obama can figure out how to improve relations with Iran?
Well, with Iran, I think. I mean, what I'm suggesting is that the Iraq War compares to the Vietnam War in the sense that both were unnecessary and both produced catastrophic failure. Nixon, to some extent, redeemed that failure through his opening to China, which had vast strategic benefits for the United States by putting the Soviet Union at a significant disadvantage. What I'm suggesting here is we need similar creativity and indeed boldness on the part of the Obama administration. My own sense is trying harder to fix Iraq is not likely to produce a positive outcome, but maybe we can examine this long-standing isolation of Iran as something that should be revisited, and perhaps there too there's a chance to make a strategic gain that offsets a failed war.
Your pieces are very critical of the Bush administration and the Obama administration. You talk about Bush being reckless in Iraq. You're talking about Obama being naive and listless, prone to grandiose talk without concerted action. Do you think he will be able to do what Nixon did?
No, I don't. The president is obviously a very intelligent man. He's not a reckless man, but he's not particularly creative in the sense that whatever else you think of Nixon, Nixon certainly was creative, nor, unfortunately, has our president surrounded himself with very creative advisors. My sense is that his inner circle consists of people who are very conventional thinkers, and they're not particularly able, therefore, to provide him with these new ideas. But the larger point here is so much of the chatter tries to fasten the blame on Obama as if everything that happened before Obama was hunky-dory. What we have is mistakes made by prior administrations compounded by mistakes made by this administration, and therefore the debate over what ought to be done ought to be one that avoids partisan overtones.
Really interesting perspectives in the pieces that you've written, and we are grateful that you joined us again to bring them to us. Thank you very much, Colonel.
Thanks for having me.